Hi guys, happy Monday. You may notice I kept the setup from Friday, and that's because I did a poll on Twitter because the comments were divided about the new setup. One person, gentleman, this is relevant, made a compelling argument about the camera angle and view of certain assets, which almost made me cave. But I did a poll on Twitter about what angle people preferred, and it was overwhelmingly in favor of the new camera angle. With almost 50 votes, 72% preferred the new angle, and that's of people who had an opinion. But the one thing that people said, other than potential for cleavage, was that they want to be able to see cats wander in the background, and that's totally fair. So I've got kind of the cat tree in the background. There's a couple of toys in the background, focus camera. I'm going to be pulling the Chachka shelf over more into the shot. This light is moving. I'm only doing that because I need more light in the background. The overhead lamp is too tall for me to replace the bulbs with my existing ladder. So it's one thing after another, but I am going to sort of pivot over the treasures more so you guys can see it. Eventually I want this to all be shelves, but yeah, I am going to do some rearranging over the next couple days. I'm going to pre-record tomorrow's video so I can do that, so I can tear all this stuff apart. So by Wednesday, be warned, people who are neuroatypical and don't like change, I am going to change the background for Wednesday. You have some days to get ready for it, to be prepared. Won't be huge, but it will be changed. And I know some people, if people wonder why sometimes I complain, I apologize for my lipstick being too bright and things like that. It is because of the portion of my audience who are great supporters, but because they are on the spectrum. Change can be a little challenging, and vibrant colors, change in appearance, it does throw some people through no fault of their own. So I try to be considerate of that. One thing that has not changed, this is a heck of a segue, is my opposition to the corporatizing of the Women's March. I should say women's marches, but this is something that has bugged me about the way Women's March Inc. Yes, they incorporated a social movement, those nice little socialists, them. But the way they've been handling themselves has caused me great consternation. One, because no one owns a freaking movement. You do get personalities that sort of rise up in a movement, charismatic personalities, but that doesn't mean they own it. And, could you imagine if, like, there were enough philosophical differences between Martin Luther King and Malcolm X? Could you imagine if they were fighting over a trademark? On top of, methods and end goals and all that stuff. Yeah, it would have been a freaking disaster. And that has been happening with the Women's March. I covered it a while back that the Women's March Incorporated, the people who organized the big Women's March in Washington after Trump got elected, it was supposed to be a pro-Hillary Clinton rally because they assumed it was going to be America's first female president. It wasn't. It ended up being an anti-Trump rally where a whole bunch of groups came together, and the only thing they could agree on is that they didn't like Trump. They were widely disparate in terms of other beliefs, other than apparently abortion. If you were not pro-choice, you couldn't come. I don't know how they stopped people from showing up in a public place, but that's neither here nor there now. Since then, or actually concurrent with that, there have been numerous instances of proven and or alleged anti-Semitism on the part of 3 of the 4 organizers of the women's movement. And apparently those things have come home to roost. And I want to talk about that today. I have been really hesitant to talk about this because I am Jewish. I do keep kosher. Well, kosher style anyway. Some people would say I don't keep kosher at all because I'm not super, super strict about it. But, I don't eat bacon. I don't eat shellfish. I don't eat milk and meat together. I don't really eat meat at all. But that is keeping kosher to me. All the little stampies. This will become relevant later. Trust me, I'm not just rambling on about my own personal practices, though some of you do find that interesting. I am very hesitant to talk about things that I identify with personally other than, being a woman, because that's kind of essential in gaming. But it's a sensitive point with me. And unlike the stuff related to gender that I've had a lot of time to sort of work through, there are certain wounds related to religion that I haven't personally worked through. That's got nothing to do with anybody but me, but I'm going to take a crack at this because I think this is important. Based on some of the reactions I got on Twitter when I tweeted this story. I want to be clear. Most of the reactions were absolutely supportive. I don't want to make it seem otherwise. More on that in tomorrow's video. You guys know I don't do the victimhood thing. This is not, this preamble is not feel sorry for me. Oh, things are so terrible. This is me going, look, bias declared. If things seem more personal or more strident than usual, it's because it's personal. Mea culpa. I almost forgot to do this. Terrible segue, actually non-segue, but help support this channel. Become a monthly patron. Patreon.com/LeannaK, or there's a PayPal link if you don't want to do the monthly thing. I'm not saying if you're mad at Patreon anymore, because the people who bounced out of Patreon and said, I'm happy to support you by other means. Oh no, apparently they have issues with PayPal too. Apparently PayPal is worse than Patreon, and PayPal is the reason Patreon has to do what it does. Well, then why are you mad at Patreon if they're being forced? Just saying, your argument is starting to seem more like excuses and less like an actual valid argument based on logic. People who claim they'd be happy to support me by fairy means because their preferred method of funding Subscribestar also got bumped by PayPal. So I have yet to be given a viable option. And funding is actually central to this. This is not completely a tangent. Let's dive into it. Let's go. Oh, I got to get the actual thing up. There we go. Okay. I'm using NBC News' website. This is going to be relevant in a bit. And I'm using it in part because it's a seen to be a left-wing source, and they have really come down on like a ton of bricks over anti-Semitism on the right. So I want you to pay attention to the very cautious hedging language in this article, because that is important. The National Women's March was rocked by claims of anti-Semitism. Now local marches are grappling with the fallout. People that were working with us began to question working with the Women's March, one organizer said. They should be saying Women's March Inc. My first issue with this is I don't know how you can trademark Women's March. That's too generic a term. Like March for Our Lives. Okay. Million Man March. Okay. These are not these are not terms so generic that you can't argue that it's too generic to copyright. I think Women's March is, like any march that is predominantly women about women's issues, is a women's march. You can't just slap ink on the, on the end of that and claim you own that term. I have a real issue with this from the outset, because it confuses things. But basically, I'm not going to read the whole thing. There's been a drop in support in local chapters, they focus on the New Orleans chapter because of claims of anti-Semitism. Notice they say claims of anti-Semitism against the leaders of Women's March Inc. have rocked the movement, with some local organizers looking to distance themselves from the group. Two of the leaders were accused of saying at a private organizing meeting that Jews bore a particular responsibility for the oppression of people of color. The New York Times and Tablet magazine reported. Claims both leaders have denied. And this is where I start going, be aware of the soft pedaling this article is doing, because Linda Sarsour, a third organizer of Women's March Inc., has also tweeted some tweets that were so virulently anti-Zionist that I maintain they are anti-Semitic. What's the cutoff? And this is why I said, be prepared for this to be personal. I am a big critic of the current government of Israel. I think the Netanyahu government is corrupt, and I've done stories about how funding for women's stuff just sort of magically disappeared. I also have a serious problem with the way the coalition government structures work in Israel, because the Orthodox political parties, and I have a serious problem with any political party organized through religion. But the Orthodox political parties are some of the biggest war hawks out there. They hold the balance of power in the Netanyahu government. They get exemptions from compulsory military service. And I have an issue with people pushing a war they personally and their children don't have to fight in because they get an exemption. Why am I telling you this? Because that is hugely different than advocating against Israel's right to exist. And this is the dog whistle that people like Linda Sarsour use when they attack Zionists, as she has done when she's not saying that Ayaan Hirsi Ali's vagina should be taken away. Linda Sarsour's a problem. She is a zealot. She is not a good face for progressivism. She has serious authoritarian leanings, and her references to Zionism. The definition of the term Zionism is up for some debate. Some people believe it's just the existence of the state of Israel. That is a belief in that Israel has the right to exist. That brands you as Zionist. Other people believe that in order to be considered a Zionist, you must see Israel as being promised to the Jewish people by God. And that means they have the ultimate claim to that land because of some sort of divine intervention. Now, because there's a discrepancy between what the term means, nobody can really agree on what the term means. I believe in the former, that Israel has a right to exist just like any other country has the right to exist. I do not believe that any place was promised to a people by God. So I'm like a half Zionist, I guess. But because of this discrepancy in terms, Zionist is a dog whistle that some anti-Semites use to bash Jews and to undermine tolerance and acceptance of Jews, Jewish practices, and Jewish communities by using a buzzword. I mean, one of the biggest anti-Semitic forgeries in history was the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. It is a dog whistle, and it laces through certain political movements like the problematic connection. And I do say problematic because I can't prove it's a problem, but the attachment, the connection that another Women's March organizer has to Farrakhan and the Nation of Islam. Not Islam, the Nation of Islam. They're different things, and I don't have time to get into the differences now. I already deconstructed Zionism, for God's sakes. But there is a dog whistle within those communities, that the whole idea that Jews, as the Women's March organizers are denying, that they said that Jews bear a unique responsibility for oppression of a people of color, that comes from the myth that because the Nation of Islam sort of adopted Islam as the de facto religion of free black people, and because of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, Jews have unique blame because oppression of Muslims, yada, yada, yada. I am butchering this because it's quick. I'm doing it quickly. Dog whistles are not simple. Here's all you need to know. It is ahistoric. It is anti-historic. During the civil rights marches of the 1960s, prominent Jewish leaders marched in solidarity with the black civil rights leaders. There has been conflict. There are class-based issues within some pockets of very insular Jewish communities that do have a great deal of racism to them. But in terms of the support for civil rights for all, Jewish leaders and Jewish groups have been incredibly supportive of the idea of equality for all. And the idea that you would single out one, some people consider Jews white, some people don't. I look whiter than a ghost, Twilight vampire territory, if it's not lit properly. So I'm the wrong person to talk about this. Again, getting into the personal sensitivities thing. But the idea that any single group on the mosaic of whiteness based on religion or based on particular subgroup affiliation is more or less responsible for racism just because of the leadership, just because of the identification with that group, that's absurd. But claiming that Jews of all people bear a unique responsibility when some Christian leaders also supported the Civil Rights March. However, there's a much greater claim to that just because of the division between black Southern Baptists and white Southern Baptists. But even that you can't say, because some white Southern Baptists deliberately, cast off that racist history and embrace racial civil rights. But that's where this dog whistle that the Women's March writes, the Women's March Inc. organizers are accused of uttering came from. And this ties in directly to the dog whistles, the very strident dog whistles that a third organizer, Linda Sarsour, has been uttering. And I said on Twitter, like, how many accusations do you need before it just, to use the cliche that these organizers own their own role in their own bigotry. I mean, we're not talking about entire groups of people here. We're talking about 3 individuals that really need to face the stuff that is coming out of their mouth and the harm it causes. And this is where I got into it with somebody on Twitter who didn't seem terribly interested in listening, and it was disappointing, because they were like, how does speech cause harm? Seriously asking. So I took them at their word, and I pointed out that, when you use language that undermines in people's minds uniquely a particular country's the lack of right for that country to exist, it does cause harm, uniquely with Israel because of its refugee work around the world. Israel has used its mandate. The critical importance for Jews regarding Israel is Jewish people are given de facto citizenship in Israel, meaning they can get out of virulently anti-Semitic countries by nature of their granted Israeli citizenship. Now, a lot of them don't stay in Israel. They end up in the US, Canada, Italy, a whole bunch of other places, because there's not enough space for them in Israel. But I went to school with a great many Russian Jewish immigrants who escaped the rumors of two different pogroms in the 90s. There were two waves of Russian Jews that came to Toronto via a stopover in Italy, and they got out because they were Jews and because Israel were just like, we'll take them. And it's not just Jews, ironically, that Israel's helped get out. There have been other groups, refugee groups, and there's not time to get into that as well. But that is a critically important thing. And when you start demonizing a country that's doing that, you undermine those refugee efforts, because those destination countries are less likely to want to deal with Israel while they're ruled by left-wing governments. I shouldn't say ruled, managed, governed. But the other big issue that has happened is this BDS campaign, the boycott, divestiture, sanctions campaign, which a lot of well-meaning people have participated in. But the problem with BDS is that it singles out one country, Israel, over the mistreatment of a group, ignoring worse behavior from other countries. You do not see a BDS movement against China for the treatment of the Tibetans, or Taiwan, or the Uyghurs. And the Uyghurs are actually Chinese citizens, unlike the Israel-Palestinian conflict, where Palestinians do not consider themselves Israeli. You're talking about a situation where they're actually two warring entities. They are at war. It's not the oppression of an internalized people. It is more similar to, and it's not similar at all, but it is more similar to Russia's annexation of Crimea. You do not see an active BDS campaign against Russia, for instance. And these are just two examples. You did not see similar things against Jordan after the Black September massacre, where tens of thousands of Palestinians either just disappeared or had horrible things happen to them. Even the treatment of the Palestinians by other countries in the region has been far more vicious than the, I believe, wrong-headed and ultimately unsuccessful Israeli approach. That doesn't make what Israel is doing right. It just is kind of curious that this one country is singled out for something that a lot of countries do. I personally find it especially hypocritical in Canada. Of course, it mainly takes hold on college campuses up in Canada. But the first thing I say to people well, what are you doing for Indigenous peoples here in Canada? What do you mean? Well, people living on First Nations reservations basically live in third world conditions. They have no clean drinking water. Kids aren't being educated. What are you doing about that? And of course, just blank. And my point is, we can do something as citizens of Canada. We can petition our government. This is actually, as citizens, something we have a right to have a say in, as opposed to telling another country, another sovereign country, how it conducts this business. Gee, we're going to be a little bit more effective, and perhaps we should look at our own wrongdoing before telling another country that they should behave better than we are. I mean, look at the U.S. The minute a few thousand, starving, dehydrated migrants got anywhere near the border, oh my God, round up kids and put them in tent cities, separate them from their parents. Countries do insane things when they get scared. And the focus on Israel uniquely is something we need to challenge. Now, how does this tie back into the Women's March? Well, organizers like, what's this lady's name? I get them all mixed up. Hang on, I'm looking up the names. Organizers like Tamika Mallory, Carmen Perez, Linda Sarsour, they are able to dodge accusations of anti-Semitism by saying, I don't have any problem with Jews. I disagree with the actions of the government of Israel, except their statements, both public and allegedly private, go beyond that. What they are accused of saying is that they were not talking about Israel. They were actually confronting a Jewish woman who was singled out for being Jewish and was told that Jews needed to confront their own role. It's not Israelis, it's Jews. And this is why they're pushing back against this accusation so hard, because it means they're caught. But they tolerated comments that were at least on the boundary between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism by one of their other organizers. And the Farrakhan connection with Mallory is established. So how many dots do we need on this graph before we can draw a line? Before we can actually say, no, Women's March Inc. got a problem that they need to address. And unfortunately, I think they're not going to address it. And it's just going to continue. People are going to continue to yank their financial support and all these local groups that were strong-armed into bear the Women's March Inc. brand, or else consequences will befall you, are going to suffer as a result. And that's too bad, because they were strong-armed into the affiliation in the first place, which I said I objected to and covered earlier. But what does this mean long-term in my 3 remaining minutes? Well, it's important to realize that just because someone is an activist doesn't make them a saint. And the expectation that these people are saints is something that means actual progress doesn't actually happen. I mean, my big complaint about the Women's March from the beginning, Women's March Inc., was, what do you want? We want to raise awareness. What? That women exist? That women are mistreated? What issue do you actually... It's not like, ironically, the anti-domestic violence activism that I covered in Israel, that we want to know where that money is. We want to cut down on this problem. We have seen a spike. We want this dealt with. We want women to stop getting killed. That people can agree or disagree with. That is a point that can be debated after a group raise awareness with this. Pink cat hats, I won't say the P word because YouTube might get mad at me. That actually does violate their terms of service as written. Don't actually start a conversation. Hashtag Me Too, love it or hate it, does start a conversation. Time's Up does start a conversation. The Women's March, it was too big and too much of an amalgam to really have a point. And no matter how much they tried to paper that over, it was a relatively it wasn't a very ineffective, there we go, protest because of that. The March for Our Lives, which a lot of people disagree with, but you can't deny that it has been more effective. It did get certain legislation pushed through both in Florida and, Trump of all people very quietly banned bump stocks. But that push in, that change in the Florida legislation was directly connected to March for Our Lives, and whether you think they're misguided or not, whether you think they have a firm grip on the issue or not, there are very valid reasons to have that opinion. They did get stuff changed. They have thrown down the gauntlet and say, this is what we believe. Let's debate this. Fight me, Women's March Inc. didn't do that. Women's March Inc. seems more concerned with controlling who uses the term Women's March. P.S. Not you Jews. That was a joke. I have to say that was a joke because some people are going to take that literally, and that's ridiculous, but that's the age we live in. But I am serious when I say they seem more interested in controlling who uses the term Women's March, which is authoritarian as all get out, than they actually do with making lasting changes. You know, even Black Lives Matter has a more clear mandate, and they're deliberately decentralized. They're structured kind of the exact opposite of Women's March Inc., and they still have a more coherent point. So my prediction is that we are seeing the end of Women's March Inc. I do think that that is a good thing because its organizers clearly have some issues relating to bigotry that they themselves need to work on. And I don't care how much they deny it. Everybody denies they have a problem before they take a good hard look at themselves in these situations. Harvey Weinstein and Kevin Spacey don't realize they have problems. John Lasseter took him a while to realize, oh, gee, he kind of sort of maybe had a problem. I don't know how much to believe that. But you know, I think they have been eclipsed by Time's Up, by Me Too. Me Too for better or for worse. That's a subject for another video. But I think this is it. Once the funding disappears, and I think part of it is people are putting their money into the Time's Up legal defense for low-income women in all industries, and apparently some men. I just read today that they are actually accepting applications from men as well because they don't want it to be gendered. That's very interesting to me, and I think that's important to note. But you know, people are putting their money into Time's Up because they know what it's doing. And for people who don't know, Time's Up isn't about just Hollywood, just about actresses being sexually harassed. That's not what it's about. Apparently, most of the people they give free legal assistance to are agriculture, hospitality workers, waitresses, things like that, people who have very little social power. So that's what Time's Up does. Yes, it was spearheaded by Hollywood, but it isn't just about Hollywood. It's for people that don't have the money to pay for their own lawyers. So if you are experiencing sex discrimination in your workplace, male or female, that is an organization worth contacting. So I'll leave it there by saying that I think we don't have to talk about Women's March Inc. anymore. Thank God. But they made it really unpleasant for a lot of us in the time that they did have power. And it's important to learn from that. So that we don't repeat that BS. To paraphrase that, to crib from A March for Our Lives, we call BS on Women's March Inc. All right. Thanks for watching.